This is an introduction to William Wordsworth's Prelude, Book 3 by Michael Elliott at the University of Calgary. And it's based on Stephen Gill's 2004 Penguin edition of the selected poems of William Wordsworth. So I'm only going to address the sections, the excerpts from Book 3 that are in Stephen Gill's edition. My previous video in this series has a more comprehensive introduction to the entire poem. Book 3 of the Prelude is Wordsworth's story of his arrival at the University of Cambridge, where he became a student in 1787. It's divided into 3 phases, the first dealing with his first arrivals and impressions of the place when in the air of expectation, the second with his increasing alienation from and melancholic feelings as he spends time there, and then those drive him outward into nature. And finally, we have a section, or a third phase, where Wordsworth is communing with previous English historical poets. The first phase, as I say, begins with a real tone of expectation and anticipation for the young Wordsworth. He's arriving in a traveling chair, in a horse and cart, and he sees the chapel of King's College in line 4 rear his pinnacles above the dusky groves. He then has a whole series of impressions wherein he sees a number of students who are wearing gowns and caps, for example. The place, as we approached, he says in line 10, seemed more and more to have an eddy's force and sucked us in more eagerly at every step he took. He is surrendering, in other words, to the feeling and impressions of this new place. And starting at line 28 at the bottom of page 218 of Gill's edition, we get Wordsworth describing this scene and the people he encountered in it. I was the dreamer, they the dream. I roamed delighted through the motley spectacle, gowns grave or gaudy, doctors, students, streets, lamps, gateways, flocks of churches, courts, and towers. Strange transformation for a mountain youth, a northern villager. As if by word of magic or some fairy's power, at once behold me rich in moneys, and attired in splendid clothes, with hose of silk, and hair glittering like rimy trees when frost is keen. My lordly dressing gown I passed by with other signs of manhood which supplied the lack of beard. The weeks went roundly on, with invitations, suppers, wine and fruit, smooth housekeeping within, and all without, liberal and suiting gentlemen's array. So you can see already in this excerpt the way that Wordsworth is selectively remembering and describing certain things that he has seen and done, and leaving other things out of his account. He has told us in line 38 that he is going to pass by certain details, but others he is going to enumerate in lists. And before long, at least by the bottom of page 219, around line 60, we can start to see why it is that Wordsworth is being so selective in his recollections. I'll now do a reading of lines 60 through 81 so you can get a sense of how this first phase is shifting into a second phase of Prelude 3. Of college labours, of the lecturer's room all studded round, as thick as chairs could stand, with loyal students faithful to their books, half and half, idlers, hardy recusants, and honest dunces. Of important days, examinations, when the man was weighed as in the balance. Of excessive hopes, tremblings withal, and commendable fears, small jealousies, and triumphs good or bad, I make short mention. Things they were, which then I did not love, nor do I love them now. Such glory was but little sought by me, and little won. But it is right to say that even so early, from the first crude days of settling time in this my new abode, not seldom I had melancholy thoughts, from personal and family regards, wishing to hope without a hope, some fears about my future worldly maintenance, and more than all, a strangeness in my mind, a feeling that I was not for that hour, nor for that place. And a bit further down that page, we can start to see how this melancholy and the sense of alienation is really leading Wordsworth away from the dazzling allure of the things that he describes so vividly and with such excitement, with the inevitability of their drawing him in. He described at the beginning of the book, "Oft did I leave my comrades, and the crowd, buildings and groves, and walked along the fields, the level fields, with heaven's blue concave reared above my head. And now it was that through such change entire, and this first absence from those shapes sublime wherewith I had been conversant, my mind seemed busier in itself than heretofore. At least I more directly recognize my powers and habits. Let me dare to speak a higher language, say that now I felt the strength and consolation which were mine." He goes out into the landscape of the fields around Cambridge, and he discovers, not surprisingly, that nature gives him access to and communion with the essences of things rather than the appearances of things in human society. Look at lines 109 to 120. "As if awakened, summoned, roused, constrained, I looked for universal things, perused the common countenance of earth and heaven, and, turning the mind in upon itself, poured, watched, expected, listened, spread my thoughts, and spread them with a wider creeping, felt incumbences more awful, visitings of the upholder of the tranquil soul, which underneath all passion lives secure a steadfast life. But peace, it is enough to notice that I was ascending now to such community with highest truth." What you can sense him moving toward is, as I say, away from the sort of world of change, of mutability, of appearances of things, and more toward an appreciation of the inner life of things. Look at lines 121 following. "A track pursuing, not untrod before, from deep analogies by thought supplied, or consciousnesses not to be subdued, to every natural form, rock, fruit, or flower, even the loose stones that cover the highway, I gave a moral life. I saw them, feel, or linked them to some feeling. The great mass lay bedded in a quickening soul, and all that I beheld respired with inward meaning." In the third phase of Book 3, Wordsworth communes with English historical poets who are associated in some way with Cambridge. He first mentions Geoffrey Chaucer at line 277, then Sweet Spencer, that's Edmund Spenser, who studied at Pembroke College, at the top of page 223, that's line 281, and finally, Our Blind Poet, a few lines below, who means John Milton. Milton is a significant source for Wordsworth. Wordsworth has mentioned him already implicitly near the beginning of the first book of the Prelude when he sets out what his subject is. But here, starting at lines 284 following down to 307, you can see the way that Wordsworth is, as a youth, already grappling with the implications of being in the same space as Milton physically. "Yea, our blind poet, who in his later day stood almost single, uttering odious truth, darkness before and danger's voice behind, soul awful, if the earth has ever lodged an awful soul, I seem to see him here familiarly, and in his scholar's dress bounding before me, yet a stripling youth, a boy, no better, with his rosy cheeks, angelical, keen eye, courageous look, and conscious step of purity and pride. Among the band of my compeers was one, my class fellow at school, whose chance it was to lodge in the apartments, which had been, time out of mind, honoured by Milton's name, the very shell reputed of the abode which he had tenanted. O temperate bard, one afternoon, the first time I set foot in this thy innocent nest and oratory, seated with others in a festive ring of commonplace convention, I to thee poured out libations, To thy memory drank within my private thoughts till my brain reeled, never so clouded by the fumes of wine before that hour, or since. You get the strongest impression here of Wordsworth as a young man who is grappling with the weight of so many traditions. First of all, just being at Cambridge University, where it feels that there's so much tradition steeped in the place, in its conduct, in its dress, in its conventions, etc. But here he is, in an episode in which he confesses he has never before been so drunk in his life, or since, that he is pouring out these libations in a kind of act of worship of Milton in the sacred space, more or less, the place where Milton was supposed to have lived when he was a Cambridge student, that Wordsworth is trying in a lot of ways to become a familiar, as he puts it, with the great traditions of the past, but also reproaching himself when he doesn't meet those expectations. The expectations, frankly, that he has put onto himself.